are we doing about white supremacy? And what are we doing about an anti-racist frame? So I'm going to offer you some ideas. Some of these may be ideas you've already heard about. I'm going to try to be very close to the source material to tell you what others have shared and taught me. This is not necessarily going to sit well with everyone, because this may not be where you're at. You know, a lot of what I think we're seeing in particularly white America right now is a willingness to listen and to think about what the particularly young Black people and a lot of LGBT Black people are saying in the streets, trans activists. Like, there's a lot of willingness right now of kind of white institutional forces to, you know, make statements about this, to talk critically about their own organizations, and I welcome that. Our school needs to do that. I need to do my own work on that. But I know there's also, you know, a desire sometimes, I think, for us to, as white people, those of us who are on today that are white, to kind of look at this as something that we want to kind of address and then kind of move on. And, you know, that's not an option for people that live this every day. It's also not really an option for us in school mental health. And that's what I'm going to kind of park on today, is that these things have been going on for, you know, 400 years, a lot of us believe, but they've definitely been going on predating the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And we have a responsibility as school mental health practitioners and educators to say, where is our role in becoming an anti-racist school mental health professional? So again, it's fine if all of this lands for you as stuff you've already thought about and thinking about. The equity stuff I read in your plans sounds like a lot of you are doing this work. So a big shout out to everybody doing that. But I also want to ask you to go with me a little bit and be willing to be a little uncomfortable, because I'm going to develop an idea that isn't mine, but that is one that's really resonated with me that I want to propagate further, which is this idea of being a accomplice or co-conspirator versus being an ally as a white person, or really as an educator, because this certainly is an issue for Black and Brown and Asian and Native peoples as well, is how do you support in your own schools, in your own populations, working from an anti-racist framework as well. So, all right, so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to speak to this for a while. And let's get started. This is all being recorded, by the way. This is all in the anti-racist resources slides. You can go get them and read along with me if you like. Okay, so here we are, and I'm going to define anti-racism and do it from a lens of what we know based on scholarly work, based on historical work. I'm going to offer some ideas about what this could look like for us, because while there's plenty of people talking about this, I would say, in education, and there are definitely people, I think, increasingly in school social work and other places doing workshops on it. We don't have a lot of writing on it just yet. It's coming, but we don't have a lot of that. So I'm going to kind of generalize or build on things that are already out there. I'm going to talk about why it matters. I think we probably are a bit of a group that doesn't need a huge rationale about why the issue matters, but maybe why this particular pathway into thinking about it and the more kind of critical consciousness aspect of it is necessary will be something I'll be interested to hear from you when you get in your small groups, what you think about it. This idea, as I said, about being a co-conspirator versus being an ally. You will bring this in your small group work, in that I will ask you to get in your groups, reflect on what you hear me talk about right now. Again, be able to bring me in, ask questions, push back, all those things. I welcome that. I'm also going to ask you to kind of think about the plan you've already created, and think about, on a scale of 1 to 10, as crude as that is as a measure, how anti-racist is your plan right now? And again, this is not to put people on any kind of scale or put people on the spot or shame them. It's to really just, you know, think about the fact that many of us in education, many of us in social work, many of us in other fields, don't reflexively think of ourselves from this angle. We like to think we do because we're a field that thinks of ourselves as a social justice field. But when you look back at your plan and you hear some of the things I'm going to get into now, how many of these things are there? And, you know, and it's fine if you say, I think our plan is an 8 or a 9, and I think there's lots to do still, but I think we're good. You may also say, you know what, we didn't think about any of that. We thought we did, but we didn't. All right, and then again, I'm going to have you take some specific questions in your groups that I just went through. All right, this is Bree Newsom. You all maybe remember this story. Maybe you've even seen this picture. It's a pretty famous picture from a Reuters photographer. She is atop the Charleston State Capitol outside of it, holding the Confederate flag that she went up and got. This is several days after the mass murder in Charleston, where a white guy went and prayed with a bunch of black Bible study folks, and then pulled out a gun and shot them all and killed them. And in keeping with how we do white mass murderers versus black people just trying to walk down the street, he was not only not killed when the cops showed up, but he was actually taken into custody, and the cops even got him Burger King as he was sitting in lockup. That horrified, beyond the murder, the treatment of him, the white supremacist nature of his intentions, horrified a lot of us. President Obama came and spoke at the church where the murder happened. And Bree and her colleagues thought that we needed to do something to really tackle the symbolic nature of what happened in South Carolina. So she climbed this pole, she took it down, lots of consternation about it. However, the governor, Nikki Haley, eventually did take the flag down, and we now know that the flags are coming down around the country in a variety of different ways. So hold this idea of her on that pole, because I'm going to show you a video in a little bit that talks about this distinction between being a co-conspirator, accomplice, and being an ally. And so I just want you to have that visual as we go. Another framing kind of a touchstone for me, and a quote, and actually an article, not an article, a text that I've read pretty regularly in my own teaching, and certainly in the last 4 months, has been the letter to the Birmingham jail from Dr. King. If you haven't yet and can, when we're ready to reopen, please get to Birmingham, Alabama, and go to the Civil Rights Museum. It's easily one of the best museums I've ever been to, just as a museum. But what it talks about, how it gets into these issues, is fascinating. They have the actual jail cell door of where he sat and wrote this letter. They have many other things that tell the story of Birmingham and its civil rights battles. So I'm just going to read this quote a little bit, because I think it does frame things for me. It also shows how these issues are not new. It also implicates, I think, a lot of us as white people about how we perceive the movements for justice when they come from, in this case, black communities, but really from other communities of color or other disadvantaged groups. So this is King writing about, I must make 2 honest confessions to you. And he's writing, and some of you probably know this, but just to tell everybody, he's writing to other clergy, people who have essentially told him, slow down, this is not the time, what are you doing? This is not, you're too extreme. You know, these are not the right ways to go about making change. All those things have been visited upon him. So he writes, I must make 2 honest confessions. First, I must confess that over the last few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block is his stride toward freedom, is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. And again, I sit with that because I think the tendency as a white person to gravitate towards a white moderate lens around a lot of issues of social change is very alluring, because it's not always, it usually isn't directly impacting my life the way it would for a black person. It is also complicated, it is messy, it implicates me. Am I part of this? Have I said or done things that implicate my own practice? So it's easier for me to critique. It's the people that sat back as the riots and the uprising was beginning saying, oh, I agree that we shouldn't kill people in the street, but no, you shouldn't loot. Or I agree that we should reform the police, but we shouldn't defund them. And again, you may have positions that say that, and I'm not saying that you're wrong to have them, but I can also say that when we talk about King and we talk about the I Have a Dream, and we talk about some of the things that I think we celebrate him for, we often forget how even early in his career, which this is relatively early in his civil rights struggles, he was already staking out a position that was much more emphatic and much more oriented towards a radical agenda. And certainly towards the end of his life, there is no doubt that he he had not gone to any kind of conservative end of how he thought social change would happen. So again, King needs to be who he is, and he's a multiple, complicated and interesting, fascinating person in his own right. But this is something that that I wanted to frame for us today. Another framing space that a lot of you, certainly my SMAP students, are aware of because we read it and reflected on it, is the 1619 project. I will put in, I didn't get to put it in yet, I will put it in. They've made it freely available. I'll put the whole PDF of all 80 pages into the anti-racist folder. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's the woman to the upper left in the bigger picture, she won the Pulitzer Prize for organizing this project at this point. She wrote an amazing essay about framing why the 1619 project. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend you read it. I think for those of you who have older kids, this could even be helpful as some ways to get into anti-racist conversations with Black and Brown, White and Asian and Native students you have. It also raises, I think, some profound issues about the current realities pre-COVID, but certainly it's been accelerated through this, of how the reality of how Black Americans came to this country, and they didn't come as Americans, they came as enslaved peoples to start with. The experience in 1619 of the first enslaved peoples landing here in Virginia and what it meant going forward is really what is so powerful about this magazine, in my view, is that it's not just history. It is history. It's often history that's not told, or history that's been kind of scrubbed or underemphasized. But the history is living now. The history is living now with our wealth disparity. It's living with the way we police. It's living with the way that we organize politics. It's definitely living with this very real issue we're all living in right now, all of us, which is we don't really have a social safety net that includes everyone. And Hannah-Jones's thesis, which I co-sign as well, I think it's got a lot to it, is we've never really had a full social welfare state because there's a part of our country that doesn't want to give that to Black people. And we've historically not given it to Black people. We've given Black people policing and incarceration and Jim Crow, but we haven't been willing to give them, say, childcare or healthcare or things after the Civil War, benefits, or coming back from World War I or World War II, the same benefits that the white GIs got. So we've consistently made decisions to not include Black people in the things that we've done around social change. And so that's where we are right now, is are we going to do something different now? And I hope we are, because I think once everyone's helped, including Black people, we're all helped, but that's where we are right now. It's not an accident too, and I promise not to talk about Trump a lot today, but just yesterday in something, I don't even know where it came up, he basically, you may have even seen this, he basically made an argument for redlining again, that, you know, in some White House conversation of saying, you know, the suburbs better not get too fair housing oriented or all the white people's property values will go down. I mean, he basically said a version of that. So this is not history, this is happening right now. But it is history, and I wonder if people know what this kind of historical art project gets at. Does anyone want to say in the chat what they think it is? Yeah, Charlene's got it. Everybody with a red dot owned slaves when they signed the Declaration of Independence. So that's where we are as a country. We've started with this amazing, brilliant, game-changing document about human rights, and the people that signed it were all white men, and many of the white men are guys that did not think that some people were human. And again, this guy that put this together. I want to give him credit, Arlen Parsa. He's actually a Chicago filmmaker. I haven't met him yet, but I hope to someday. Another way to kind of think about where we are, and this again is a document, and I got it sent to me by a medical student, so I don't have the site. I apologize. That's bad professor behavior, but it's certainly not mine. I didn't create it. But what I want you to do, and you can look at this a little bit on your own time in your small groups, is look at how many things are below that big, thick line and what's above. And I would submit that those of us who are listening to this who are white, I would say most of us would be horrified and flinch and be able to some extent tut and look down on anybody who does the things above the thick line. Because those are things that we can decide as white people is extreme, that's racism, we deny that, we denounce that, right? what we also know is that a lot of the things underneath this are things that white people and white supremacy have been doing for 400 years. Some of them are things that we do very well in schools, and we do them sometimes unthinkingly. I would invite you, when you look at your own school plan and the things you've done, to look at how many of these are there implicitly. Certainly this white savior complex is something I think all of us in social work and school mental health and education have to work through, that we're not there to take these young people who come from families that don't look like ours or don't have the experiences that we might have had, that we're not there to fix them, that we're there to do something else for them that hopefully is joining these families and these kids and doing something that is, the view I use is culturally humble. I'm not interested in cultural competence, even though our code of ethics calls for it. I think that itself a white supremacist idea, that I can go into anywhere else and be competent in somebody else's culture, strikes me as offensive in a lot of ways, but it is part of our code of ethics. But look at this list, look at the things that are in here, and think about where maybe you've been part of these things. And again, I want you, the reason I told you about my kind of from birth kind of formation around these issues is I grew up in a house where we talked about religion and politics all the time, and we argued, and we got into it. And it took me going to college to realize that wasn't how most people, at least most white people, talked, and that was not considered good social manners to get into conversations like that. And that there was particularly a lot of my white friends and people I knew in my college experience that were terrified of being called racist. And again, I'm not here to tell you that I've tried to be racist or that I spent a lot of time doing things that are on this slide. But I'm also not, as you'll see in a minute, I want to be an accomplice. I want to be somebody who doesn't flinch in my own kind of white fragility, which I know is another hot book right now we're talking about. I don't want to model to the larger world I'm trying to be part of that this is all about me, that this is something that I can't handle if you challenge me or you call me out in some way. So again, this is a way I think you might want to take and look at for yourself and for your team. Another way that could be helpful that really kind of shone a light to me as we were talking about all these young Black people, but particularly recently just Black adults just in their house, Breonna Taylor in her bed getting killed. But a lot of this violence that police have visited on youth, and we'll get into cops in schools in a minute, has been basically because we pathologize and criminalize what young people do. We do it in schools, we do it in the community, we do it through the way we talk about young people, calling them thugs, etc. And this is a comedy writer. I don't know what show she writes for. She's pretty famous in her own world of comedy writing. But she put this up, and it went viral. It exploded in mid-June. And she described a lot of really kind of messed up things she'd done, and it happened. She hadn't killed anybody, but she had done some pretty messed up things that easily could have gotten her into major jail trouble and or, depending on the right cop, right time, killed or beat up or sexually assaulted or all the other things that we know police have done disproportionately to Black and brown people. And so what she basically said was, think about the crimes you've committed. You don't call them crimes, you and your parents call them mistakes. You were a young person, your parents were able to maybe get you out of it, or they were able to rationalize it, or certainly the boys will be boys is something we see a lot. And what was so interesting was the explosion of this on Twitter was a lot of white people saying, yes, that was me. Yes, I would have not probably made it to 20 if I had done this and I was Black. Many people of color also joined the mentions and said, thank you for raising this. This is why I've been worried about raising my sons in this current context, or this is why I'm very conscious, and I know lots of Black and brown families talk about how they prepare, particularly their male children, about how to interact with police. And this was a very fruitful conversation that just happened on social media. So again, there's lots of spaces to do this, and I invite you to think of your own. So again, this is somebody that I hope by now you're at least heard the name of, Dr. Kendi. I have not had pleasure yet of meeting him or being in a space with him. I hope to someday. He is really kind of, I think, done some really great framing of what I'm going to show you now, which is what it means to be an anti-racist. And I'm going to quote him directly. I'm going to share kind of my understanding. Some of you may have been involved in studying this or looking at this yourself, and certainly feel free to comment on that or bring that into your small groups. And there actually is I think someone's even put it in right now. There's an event, I think, next Monday as this list. So you can go check him out directly. You don't have to take my word for it. So he develops this idea, and I want to say up front, as an academic and as a person who likes to think critically about things, that this is a rhetorical argument, right? It is a framework, but it's an argument, right? There easily will be people, and maybe some of you will look at this and say, well, this can't be so black and white. This can't be so binary. But for now, stay with me and look at it, because I do think it helps frame what is different with thinking of yourself engaging in anti-racist practices versus what I think we sometimes do, which is talk about diversity or talk about equity in ways that are fairly toothless. So a racist isn't just somebody who says the words that were above that thick black line, or does things that clearly are offensive, whether it's wearing blackface or certain other ways to signify racism. It's someone who supports racist policies through their actions, and I would argue through their inactions sometimes. And then this one is an anti-racist is the opposite. Someone who supports this policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. So putting yourself in a space where you say and do things that manifest in a space that challenges kind of the dominant structure you're in. Now, this is where I love Kendi's work, because one of the other things I think we can all easily fall into is looking at these things as very fixed. And I don't want to wade into what I think a lot of people on the right like to get into right now is, whether black and brown people can be racist themselves. Like, I think Kendi has a very nuanced take on that I encourage you to read his take on it. But he says racist and anti-racist are like peelable name tags that are placed and replaced based on what someone is doing or not doing, supporting or expressing in each moment. They are not permanent tattoos. No one becomes an anti-racist or an anti-racist. So even though I titled my talk On Becoming, I didn't know how else to frame it other than I wanted to raise that for you today. What does this mean? Is this something else that requires what he talks about here? We can unknowingly strive to be a racist. We can knowingly strive to be an anti-racist. Like fighting an addiction, being an anti-racist requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and regular self-examination. Now, I would submit that as educators, as people that showed up to do this work today, that you probably do a fair amount of this on a lot of other things you do related to your work. You may even just be someone who does that, just in your own personal life, that you reflect, you try to create a space for self-care where you look at yourself, you look at your environment, you look at what you've done. This is where I think of the virus, so to speak, of racism, and how it presented right at the duality of these brilliant white men creating this amazing document of human rights, being able to hold in their head the idea that even those people that they were celebrating didn't count as more than 3/5 of a person. So the human rights didn't extend to everyone, even in that moment of clarity for the world. So how do we do this? This is, I think the addiction imagery is pretty interesting, and I need to think about it more myself. But anyone who's had an addiction, whether it's to food, to substances, knows that you can't just kick it. You have to do it every day. It's a one day at a time thing, right? So that's essentially what I think Kendi's getting at, is that these things are not fixed. These things are situational, but we can work at it. And I would say, for me, I knowingly strive to be an anti-racist. Whether I succeed and whether that's what happens every day, that's not up to me fully, but I strive to do that. Here's more from Kendi. What is a racist idea? He wants to develop that, and that's part of what I want to invite you to go into your groups in a bit and look at from your own plans. A racist idea is any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior or superior to another racial group in any way. Racist ideas argue that the inferiorities and superiorities of racial groups explain racial inequities in society. So this is very prevalent, and you can find lots of examples on this in our society right now. An anti-racist idea is actually an idea that suggests that racial groups are equals in all their apparent differences, that there is nothing right or wrong with any racial group. Anti-racist ideas argue that racist policies are the cause of racial inequities. So again, there's a lot there to unpack. We could do a whole seminar, we could do a whole semester looking at that. There are, to be fully transparent, there are people who are thinking critically about race who would argue that there are things that are unequal, not because people are racially, biologically different, but because we've structured things so that the differences that manifest in our society are so hardwired into us at this point that we have to do things that are actively anti-racist that target those things. But Kendi really argues that what we really need to do is, do we get to a place where we treat everybody in a way where we don't assume that the racial group they're in explains their differences? And again, this is a complicated idea, and I'm happy to unpack it with you all when you invite me into your groups. But what he's arguing is that racist policies are the cause of racial inequities. That the reason that we have schools that look different is because we've decided as a society that some people get certain things because of their race, and that we have, you know, centuries of examples of that. We're seeing that play out with COVID. Equity is where a lot of this can manifest for us, and this is where we can get very, I think, specific about what education means in our role in this. And this is from Paul Gorski and his colleagues' work. I always like to feature it because I like the work. I also like it because he's a white man himself, and he steps into this space and says, I'm here to strive to be an anti-racist. I don't want any awards for it, but I'm trying to raise these issues, and I'm going to tell tales out of school, so to speak, of what other white educators have said to me over the years. So what he talks about is the direct confrontation principle. There's no path to equity that does not involve a direct confrontation with inequity. So when we use diversity statements, when we talk about representation, those things are not empty, those things are not unimportant, but they don't get at the structural issues that, that might actually reproduce the inequity. Certainly there is things within this that I think are really spicy and interesting, and I think they're worth looking at. Number 5, I want to kind of look at a little bit with you, the redistribution principle. All right, this idea that it is about redistributing resources, and that is something Americans are deeply uncomfortable with in lots of ways. We do it, but we rationalize it in different ways. We get very anxious when we think about redistributing resources, even though we have a lot of history of doing that for specific groups. The idea of fixing injustice, not kids. So one of the things I think as a school mental health professional myself, I could easily fall into is to want to fix a kid when in fact some of what makes the kid be in the situation they are, making the choices they are, is the structures that the schools put in place and maybe the larger society. And so these are just some examples. This is all on the slides you can look at and think about. All right, now what is an accomplice? All right, I've been talking about that word a bit, and then I'm going to show you this video that builds on Bree Newsom's scaling the pole to get the flag. So actor, ally, accomplice. An ally is something I think we've seen a lot of. There's certainly a lot of writing about it. I'm not here to tell you it's bad. I'm not putting value judgment in that way on it. I am, though, going to argue that it's not sufficient, right? I think there's something to be said when you look at the accomplice to ask yourself, does that actually move the needle? Does that get us to where we are maybe a more just society as we move forward? So, and again, this comes from a site called whiteaccomplices.org. So you can go look at that and go check them out. So the actions of an accomplice are meant to directly challenge institutionalized racism, colonization, and white supremacy by blocking or impeding racist people's policies and structures. And then this one, realizing our freedoms and liberations are bound together, all right? And you know, as a white middle-aged professor talking about this, it's also really important that we, our actions are not about us ultimately. They're informed and directed and often coordinated with leaders, people doing this work for a long time. And I'm going to show you examples of youth been doing this work a long time that are themselves Black, brown, and indigenous peoples, because those people are closest to the pain. Those people have the most access to what works. And they're going to live with the consequences of whatever you do as a white accomplice. So thinking of yourself in that way is really important. I do also want to say that as I'm talking, I'm directing a lot of this obviously to our majority white population of school mental health professionals, and even on this workshop, we have most of us here, I think, are white. That doesn't mean that there isn't work that all of us can do in this, and it also means, though, I think as accomplices, we have to look around and find the people of color who are doing this work and empower them, and to say to them, what do you need? And this gets to actively listening with respect, understanding that oppressed people are not monolithic. There's a lot of discussions and debates in communities of color right now about how to respond to this Black Lives Matter moment and this opportunity. Listen to those things, ask them, ask your youth. This one I think is really important, particularly those of us who work close to trauma, work close to really intense situations, and are ourselves going to be in positions where we see lots of this happening. Accomplices aren't motivated by personal guilt or shame. They are not emotionally fragile. So while I think D'Angelo's work on white fragility is a really important starting point for some of us, I think it needs to very much be something we move past quickly. That yes, we need to understand what the fragility is, maybe in us and the people around us, but how do we get to a place where that is not driving what we do? That we are really able to stand with people who are being oppressed and people that are living this and do things for them. And again, it's all about building it through consent and being accountable. So it's not just me pontificating on a computer today, it's me doing the work to partner, to connect, and to reach out. So speaking of, these are the amazing young people from Chicago and a group called Good Kids Mad City. Some of you may have seen some of their amazing work on social media as well as their work in the neighborhoods. They've been at it for many years now, in really post Ferguson in 2014 and the murder of Mike Brown. But they've been sounding the alarm for a long time now about how important youth voice is and how important it is to put youth voice in front and center. One of my favorite moments was in the midst of the initial kind of unrest and street protest. Kanye West, who's now, I guess, going to run for president or whatever he's saying today, showed up at a Black Lives Matter protest that was organized by Good Kids Mad City. And, you know, there was predictably, when a celebrity shows up, a lot of kind of buzz. And I don't think it's either of these black women in red right here, but one of the black women that, young women that ran the protest, took the mic and said, "Welcome, Kanye, but this is not a protest for celebrity welcome. You're welcome to join us, but this is a protest we organized and we're going to keep moving." And I love these guys before that, but that really said a lot to me, that we are talking about a mass movement right now that's coming from black and brown youth, a lot of them additionally LGBTQ youth, who are asking the question, where are we in this struggle, and how do we join each together, and how do we get help from white accomplices and others, other adults, to do the work? So this is some more of their work. This is other groups too. Voice is a group that you all that were with us yet last year met them and their work. They're another youth activist group in Chicago. This was a die-in outside the Thompson Center downtown Chicago around police-free schools, which again is a movement that has so far had some ups and downs in Chicago because our current context is still very pro-police and pro cops in schools. And so the 4-3 vote from the school board to keep the contract was really the biggest district that didn't take action. Many other big districts and small districts, including my own in Oak Park, took action to remove police from their schools. But Chicago youth are not being deterred. They're going to keep at it. So they're not just keeping at it by visual protests. They're actually putting data together. So again, this makes the researcher and me just super excited and proud, and I've published this with their permission. This is a group called Students Strike Back, so it's a different group. This is on schoolsocialwork.net right now. That, you know, one of the reasons the police in schools is such a hot button issue in a Black Lives Matter context, in an anti-racist context, and in a white accomplice context, is data like this, that 95% of police incidents in CPS involve students of color. Black students are subjected to police notifications at 4 times the rate of white students in Chicago. And Black students currently make up 36% of all CPS students, but 66% were the subject of police notifications. And again, this is publicly available data the kids went and got and they did stuff with. They did further. Think of all those of you in elementary school. 316 kids were arrested or put in some sort of police action in CPS schools. And think of somebody that age and what it had to take to get a police officer involved, and how the adults in the building decided they couldn't handle that young person enough that the police officer needed to get involved. This comes from an activist who I think really said it well, that a lot of us, and maybe some of us sitting here today, say, well, if there's no police, how do I protect my students from others of my students? And this person says they're making a persuasive point, but it's the opposite of the point they're trying to make. And I'll ask you to kind of sit with what you think that means. But I mean, this is again, I think, where things have come to in this crucial moment is, you know, police in schools in a lot of ways has a lot of implications for trauma for students. It's often been identified with security and safety. I think we're seeing lots of people, the voice group I showed you earlier, is challenging us to rethink safety and to think about whether that is actually making our youth feel safe. We have lots of research at this point, and certainly what's happening on the ground with young people of color is they're saying that doesn't make us feel safe. It makes us feel unsafe or worried. There's also some compelling evidence from some of my colleagues that study school violence that a police officer on site is not going to make kids more likely to disclose some of the hot button issues that I think got cops in schools to begin with, like school shootings or big fights, because they don't want to snitch, or they don't want to be involved in getting someone else in their school community to be possibly arrested or brutalized by a cop. So again, these are issues that are happening right now and are happening all over the country. It also gets down to us. It gets personal. This is data from the school of Chicago Public Schools. Some of you in CPS know this data pretty well. We are very interested in funding school resource officers much more at a higher clip than the school counseling and other related services. A lot of the Chicago Teachers Union strike the fall was centered around getting us to where we talked about the need for a school social worker, a school nurse, and a school librarian in every building. Boy, does that seem important now, given what we're seeing with this pandemic and the reopening discussion. But this is also a set of choices. We've decided that safety means cops, doesn't mean restorative practices, having police be in a secondary role outside the buildings, called in only at last ditch efforts, and that otherwise it's on the adults to do things at a three-tier way to make kids safe and to ensure that the school functions well. It's also about, this is a really great example of being an accomplice and a support. This comes from a community organization of adults, Chicago Teachers Union and Brighton Park Council group, who joined with youth to demand these things. And I went to this protest myself and wrote about it for schoolsocialwork.net. And these are the things they're looking for. And again, these are structural things. These are anti-racist, arguably anti-racist things. These aren't just writing a statement saying we support all Black lives. This is saying these are things that could actually really change the game, at least in the view of the people that made these demands. And again, these things are having ripple effects. You're looking at the superintendent of my twin boys' high school in Oak Park, who introduced a resolution or a proposal at the meeting last week to talk about putting a moratorium on having the school resource officer on contract in the school. And then what then ensued, and was fascinating, because again, I think the youth had a lot to do with this, the board members asked questions that basically said, what do we know about what the police officers have done? And what was so interesting was that they didn't know much. They didn't collect much data on it. And the police department was not very forthcoming with the data. They've had a cop and a police officer in schools in Oak Park since the Columbine massacre in the late 90s. They didn't have a lot of information about what that police officer did. And so what then happened was the school board members themselves introduced a resolution saying, we want to resolve that we just actually cancel this contract. And in real time, as I'm sitting there watching this board meeting, that happened on Zoom, that they canceled the contract. So dismantling and looking at things from this lens is possible. It also needs to be done with careful consideration as well. This is Richmond, Virginia. That's the statue of Robert E. Lee. Was turned into a massive public art protest project. I believe it's been shut down in terms of people being able to walk around it now, for now. But it was amazing to look at this and this is a drone view of all the colors, and this is Pride, the Stonewall riot anniversary. So I'm going to go through this quickly because I wanted us to get to some comments and then and why I wanted to watch this short video. The trauma lens is essential for all the stuff we're talking about these 2 days. This is from SAMHSA's guidance about principles and key elements of trauma-informed care. You can go look at those. You can look at what you've done already and see how well it matches up. This is a systematic review that some of you know about, that I've talked about. I teach in our SMAP program about how little we actually know about trauma-informed care in schools, that we have some really great things at Tier 3 and Tier 2 to do. But when we say we're a trauma-informed school, there's a lot we just don't know. And so that's an important thing for us to consider as we make our plans in this small group exercise. This is just more about the study I'll move out of right now. All right. One of the questions, though, that I do want you to sit with as you relook at your plans is, can a school district really claim to be trauma-informed if they employ police? And again, we had some really rich conversations on the network about this. I really struggle with how that can be possible. I know that there is, just like in everything, people say not all cops, my police officer is great. How does that balance with the very real lived reality that, particularly if you're in a community where the majority of students are students of color, there's a lot of evidence that shows that having that police car out front, as they said at my school's board meeting, or having the police officer walking around armed through the hallways, has a negative impact on that student's feeling of safety. So again, these are complicated issues, but I wanted to raise them. We also have wonderful, and you can see some of the folks that are with us today, actually all of those people you can see that are with us today. We have had conversations in our SMAP courses around these issues, and we also look at the issue of restorative justice, and all of the current cohort students wrote research briefs about what the evidence is for restorative justice in schools. And it's better than the evidence for trauma-informed care. There's still a lot to do. We don't know as much as we need to know. And if anything, I hope that what comes out of this current era we're in is that people really start to move and tackle these issues more fully. All right, so we're back to Bree Newsome. So I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Bettina Love, and I'm going to go out of this and go get her clip from C-SPAN 2. She is a professor, I believe she's an education professor. She may have multiple appointments at University of Georgia. She wrote a really powerful book that I would recommend you all check out about abolitionist teaching called We Want to Do More Than Survive. She herself, I guess, though she teaches in Georgia now, she grew up in upstate New York. She'll talk about that in this little clip and be pretty funny about it and compare it to New York City. And she, if you know much about that part of America, that is one of the real focal points of the Underground Railroad and the abolitionist movement. And Harriet Tubman eventually went to stay there and had her home there and died there, actually. So she lived there a long time. So all of that forms a bit of what she talks about. But mostly what she talks about is that example of Bree Newsome and a white man, and I think his first name is James. His second name is escaping me right now. And he stood at the base. First of all, he had a farm where they had poles for, I don't know, for what, for tents or something. Anyway, they had poles on his farm in North Carolina, and she practiced climbing up the pole. He gave her access to that, and they practiced it. And he helped teach her how to climb up a pole safely. And they decided that she would be the one to do it, even though others could do it as well. As a Black woman, she wanted to be the person to do it. And then he did some things you'll hear about from Dr. Love that I think really speak to being a co-conspirator versus being an ally. All right, so it's about a 6-minute clip, and we'll watch that, and then we'll do a little bit more, and then we'll get into groups.
With Black women.
Yes, yes.
Where do we start? Start with Black women.
Yes, yes.
That's where you start.
And as we start with Black women, we know that no movement is done alone. And so again, thank you for giving us language. The next question is for both of you. You make the move from allyship to co-conspiratorship. So the question I want you to sit with is, can you identify, once Dr. Love gives us a definition, can you identify a co-conspirator that you've had in your work? Mm-hmm. And can you break down for us this difference between an ally and a co-conspirator?
Yeah, so
I bet you can.
So, the book is about this idea of abolitionist teaching, right? And so, shout out to upstate New York. I'm from upstate New York. We don't like New Yorkers, but that's okay. Because when you're from upstate New York, like, where you from? I'm from upstate. Queens? No. Brooklyn? No. Albany? No. I'm from upstate New York. Rochester, New York. 90 miles from Canada, right? And so, so we had abolitionists in upstate New York. That's where I grew up. And the one thing about an abolitionist had to be a co-conspirator. I mean, I want y'all for a second to just think about the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad freed over 100,000 enslaved Africans and Black folks. Right? Think about this. There was no Twitter. There was no Facebook. There was no Instagram. bondage no more.
Yeah.
We did that. It was everyday people. Farmers, bankers, doctors, teachers, nurses, all ethnicities. We did that as a country. Someone came to your door, gave you a code, you just had to trust them. And so I wanted to bring that back. What would it mean for us in 2019 to think about what it would mean to be an abolitionist and to be a co-conspirator? And in the book, I use James Tyson. Now, many people are not familiar with who James Tyson is. You know Bree Newsom. Bree Newsom was the young Black woman who took that Confederate flag down in South Carolina 8 days after Dylann Roof went into the AME church. And I tell the story in the book because I think it's an important story because Bree Newsom and James Tyson did not know each other. There were some folks who got together and said that flag is coming down. They said, and a Black woman's going to take it down. They taught Bree how to climb. They had Bree's bail money ready. And that morning, Bree Newsom and James Tyson were at an IHOP. They got the word, come take the flag down. Bree Newsom climbs up on the pole to take the flag down. Now, this is where the difference between an ally and a co-conspirator is. James Tyson, now there's a gate for the flagpole. James Tyson isn't standing like outside the gate. Okay, like Bree, they coming, Bree. Hey, Bree. No, James Tyson, he is inside. And then the police say, you know what? We can get her down. Takes the pole. James Tyson, because he wasn't here, he was here, said, okay. He put his hand on the pole. That white man at that moment understood why he was there. He put his hand on the pole, and he knew that the police would not tase that pole with a white man, healthy white man, right there. He saved their life. That's what it means to be an ally. You can stand out there, and allies know all the language. They read all the books. They come to the meeting with all the terms. Right? They read the report before you read the report. Right? I always say allies make Black folks feel bad. Like, did you read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book? I didn't read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book. Like, you know, I've been busy being Black. Right? I didn't read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book, but I know it's fire. Right? So they come and they know everything and they good. And then after the meeting, you like, well, what we gonna do? They go, you like, hey, they left already? Where they go? I'm gonna call them, right? So that's the difference between being an ally and a co-conspirator. You know, and this is that back to that abolitionist. It's to put something on the line for somebody. Yeah. Take a risk to see how to use your whiteness. And I tell folks all the time, whiteness is like a bank. And it just, your ATM card just replenishes itself. So spend it. As the kids say, cash out. Right? Cash out. It's gonna come right back. And so to be a co-conspirator, I try to write in the book, is to take risks for somebody. To put something on the line, but to use it in a way in which you're using your privilege.
Yes.
Use it. And I'm not just talking about white folks, I'm talking about cisgender folks. Use it for trans folks, like use it for queer folks. Put something on the line. Take a risk. It doesn't have to be a small risk, big risk. James Tyson simply said here, put his hand on the phone. And that's what we are talking about with co-conspirators. Allies, they know everything. They can say, they can talk it. But when it's time, they're not there. And if they're there, they're looking at you like, you going? Oh, you going. You go on the front lines, right? Black folks and brown folks, we don't want to fight racism. The Creator did not put me here to fight racism.
Yeah.
If you believe that, that's racist. Full life and be my full self and my full human.
Yes.
But I gotta fight what y'all created. So they gotta come to the table with something more than just I read the new book.
Right.
Right. Take a risk.
Okay. So there's a lot in there, a lot that I want you all to kind of sit with and think about, and we can do a little bit of interaction. I know I've gone a little over. We will make time for you to get in your small groups and do breaks and all that. But I want to say a few more things on slides, and then we will shift into groups again. So a lot that I think Dr. Love talks about, I think really critically, is this idea of what it means for us in schools as educators, particularly as white educators, to put things on the line. And I think that can feel very risky. I think it can also feel kind of confusing. It can also feel like at this moment, with everything else that's flooding into us and our own worries and our own experience of the pandemic, it could feel challenging. But I think what I want to offer you is some considerations, is what I intend to do, and what I would encourage all of you to think about ways you can do. How to become a co-conspirator in your school and community, and show that you're in it for the long haul. One of the things I'm hearing again and again from people I'm partnering with and talking to in Black youth activist circles and in other spaces in my own school, university, is the very, I think, legitimate wariness that a lot of Black and brown people are having right now about, okay, what's this going to be like in 6 months, right? Where are people going to be? I mean, Dr. Love just talks about literally like after the meeting, people are gone. But even people that are saying, okay, yeah, it's really good that we're making these moves and we're making these commitments, but where's it going to be in 4 months, 6 months, 8 months, a year? So what does that mean for you to be in the long haul of this? The thing I think that she talks about that I think is really powerful is this idea that some of our white privilege, those of us who are white on this call today, is this renewable resource. And so how do we build awareness where we are and do our own work? I also think, she doesn't talk about it, but a couple other articles that are in that folder written by a Black public health author is one of them, is that there's also internalized racism that people of color have carried with them into their own work, into their own experiences. That is another way to think about, what she said, Dr. Love said a minute ago about, I wasn't put on this earth to fight racism. I was put on this earth to live my life, but I have to because that's where we are. So what does that mean for people of color listening to me right now? It's like, what internalized racism have you absorbed that is impacting your ability to be effective and a co-conspirator? It's essential, I think, and the phrase that the young people have taught me is pass the mic. This is largely about young Black and brown people right now, and I want to center them. I want to give them voice, and I do that as much as I can with what I'm doing on social media, and I intend to keep doing that. But ultimately, I think what's also really important is that we not just make this about 400 years of oppression and the very real threats to Black lives that are happening right now, but there's an enormous amount of joy and power in this struggle. Again, that was baked into me kind of with my civil rights kind of formation as a child, because I got to be around and witness and hear stories of how even in the midst of very, very serious times, there was joy and there was hope. My favorite example of the Cops Out of School protest that the Good Kids Mad City and Voice Kids did is they went outside the board president, Miguel Devalle, I believe is his name. And, they were strong. They called him out. They asked him to come out and meet them. He refused. But then they also did some line dancing. They did some really joyous expression of protest where they were enjoying themselves too. And so I take breath from that. I look at that and I say, well, if that's how the young people that are putting their bodies on the line can interact and do this, I need to listen to that. Another example that was very powerful is a group of protesters went to Mayor Lightfoot's house right before the vote and demanded that she support it, which she doesn't. She doesn't support having cops out of schools. She kicks it to local schools, councils, but she doesn't really support it. And sure enough, a ton of police showed up outside her house. It was basically like a barricaded environment. And again, because the kids are going to win and kids know what they're doing, the kids had gone into the police database and basically standing there, a young Black woman read out loud all the use of force complaints against the police officers that were there on their badge numbers. It's one of the most amazing, just vivid examples of protest. And, I wouldn't call that even joy. I would call that ferocity, but there's a dynamism and a creativity. And your young people, even if they don't take any direct action around Black Lives Matter and get in the street, they have joy. They have ways that they are expressing themselves, and that they're loving life. And you know, we need to know about that. We need to celebrate that. And then I don't want to put too much pressure on anybody, and I also want to acknowledge this work is hard and complicated, but I would love someday to have any or all of you submit something to our schoolsocialwork.net site about what you've heard today and some of the things you've done since, and what that means to you to be a co-conspirator. What's your version of putting your hand on the pole like that white man did for Bree Newsome? You know, what will that look like? I don't know. I mean, I intend to keep writing and thinking about it and doing my own work and keeping myself accountable with it. But you all have ways to do that too. All right. Here's that equity literacy thing again. This is a slide I've used before. You can look at that as you get into the October responses I'll be giving you later this morning. You know, complex change, which is what we're all trying to do and making plans to go into fall, is going to require you to have a lot of things in place. When we don't have vision, skills, incentives, resources, and an action plan, we have something else. We often have these other things that ensue. So you can look at those things and think about complex change, which obviously we're all in the midst of right now in this kind of disaster situation. All right, so this is your takeaways, and I am gonna to make space if people want to put in the chat box any comments or questions they have for me right now, please do. And I can speak to them now. I can also speak to them more in the small groups. I will also be looking to get you in your breakout rooms in a bit. So the first is, you know, you've heard me talk for the last hour or so about being an anti-racist school mental health practitioner. What was new about this? Get in your small groups, talk about what was new. And maybe some of you, none of this was new. Some of this was, you know, I've heard all this before, or, you know, this is what I think, you know, he could have said additionally. All those things are fair. But I also am really interested to know, like, what are you going to maybe apply back to your school context, not just this role play simulation we're doing, but to your own school context. Where does this land for you? What are you going to do with it? Now then, I want you to go to your reopening plan, which, by the way, I meant to say, I left this out when I was getting ready and excited to talk about all this. Of the groups, looking at the groups, we have 4 elementary groups, 2 middle, 2 high school, 3 high school, I should say. We have hybrid plans for 2 elementary, both middle, and 2 high school. We have fully online for 2 elementary and 1 high school. And those fully online have an idea of phasing in reopening in person in some form. So as we got into the work yesterday, and as I read it more overnight, you know, you did a lot of careful consideration about that. So I invite you to now look at these ideas that I've developed today and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how anti-racist do you think your plan is? And kind of discuss your rating and why. And again, it's fair, it's completely fine for these ratings to be all over the place, because that was not what I charged you with doing. I did ask you to think about equity work, which I think obviously relates to this, but I didn't frame things directly this way that I'm doing today. So have that conversation for a while. And then eventually you will want a break. Maybe you'll want to take a break even before we even get started. But I do then want you to invite me into your group to tell me if there's anything about your plan you've changed. And also then I'll ask you some other questions that I have prepared for everybody about your plans. And then I will give you kind of the next step in the choose your own adventure. I'll tell you where we're going and what happened to your school and all that. And I'll play the role of the superintendent or the state board of ed guy. All right? Okay. Pat is asking how do we invite into the group. I believe you should have a button, Pat, that's in there. It should be easy to do. If you're not able to, yeah, it says ask for help. Shannon's helping us as she says that. The Google file, again, someone have that handy. I'll pull it up as we go here, but oops. Here, I'm just bouncing around a little bit, sorry guys. So while I'm doing that, comments, questions, lots to sit with, lots to think about. Thank you, Lisa. All right. So again, let's let's go to your groups. When I hit the button, a lot of you won't be there yet because you came in as I was trying to add people. So I will do that. I have the right list for everybody. Michelle's telling people she'll be a little late to group 9. So it is 9:48. We will break for lunch at noon, but basically now it is your group time to work. So I would say probably the stuff I've just given you, I would expect at least 30, 45 minutes of you doing that work and then calling me in, and then we will do the next phase before we get you to lunch. Okay? All right. Enjoy your small groups, and we will talk. And again, anybody that hasn't been invited, I'm in the process of inviting you now, so do not worry. Just going to kind of go in order of the groups, so it may take a little while for me to get down to the lower groups. I'll start with the group leaders, though, to make sure they're there for you. It looks like I've got all of the group leaders, I believe. All right, so I'm just going to start working through. Apologies for the time on this, guys. We'll get it done.